What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This is episode 39, and today we are covering Empire of Silence, the first book in the Sun Eater series by Christopher Ruocchio. I have the UK or the US edition hardcover here. I actually spent most of my time reading out of the UK limited edition, blue page, signed, and numbered version of the book because for some reason this one just felt a little bit too loose to use. I don't know how to explain it. I actually just preferred reading out this edition of it for this specific book. But I think, unlike the Dark Tower series, which I covered most of those videos over the space of the last couple months, I think the way that I cover this series will be a little bit different. So forgive me for having so much Dark Tower content pretty much all at once on the channel. I'm sure that some of you guys will be excited to hear my thoughts on Sun Eater, but I don't want to just drown all of my Book Binge content in Sun Eater related content over the course of the next several months, so I'm going to try to space out my Sun Eater reviews a little bit more. But I can talk a little bit about that later in the conclusion of the video. For now, let's talk about Empire of Silence, and man, what a debut. First of all, what are the best elements of Empire of Silence? Let's start off like normal. One of the coolest parts, in a way, especially if you're a fan of the book, chapter 1 of Empire of Silence, it's very reminiscent of one of the early chapters in Dune where Paul is training. That's all I'll say. This first chapter is incredible. I really enjoyed the way that Ruocchio introduces you to Hadrian's character, both in a couple different ways, one of which we'll discuss a little bit later on. But I just really enjoyed the way that Ruocchio was able to use this Dune influence to create something, at least early on, that feels familiar, not entirely alien, but that is quickly able to become its own thing, because it is very soon after these opening chapters, which there is a lot of Dune influence throughout a lot of the early book. When I say the early book, I mean like the first, handful of chapters. But when it does become its own thing, it does so very well. But the familiarity of Dune early on is very well appreciated. It also has a lot smoother of a learning curve than Dune, because Dune is rather complex. It's a little bit hard to get into unless you kind of know what's going on. The only reason why I was able to enjoy Dune as much as I did, I think, is because I watched the 2021 movie adaptation from Denny V twice before I actually read it. So a lot of the names, a lot of the world building characteristics and stuff felt familiar. So the fact that this book has that influence, but is also able to build up the world and the characters and kind of the planet, the society, in a way that I think is a lot easier to digest, is really appreciated. Furthermore, the lore and the universe building of Empire of Silence exceeds the quality of Dune by miles for me. Now, Dune, you can tell it's a vast universe set in the future, pretty much. And the similar thing is here. There's thousands of years between us and the time period it's set in the book. In fact, it is made very clear that Earth is kind of a long-lost remnant of time in Empire of Silence and the Sun Eater universe, and is referred to as kind of this ancient relic of kind of religious importance in some essence throughout the book. So you can tell it's set very far in the future, but I think the problem that I had with Dune was just the fact it only really takes place on a couple planets, and then beyond that, there's like references and a couple scenes that might take place in other locations, but none of that really meant much to me. In this book, you can feel the vastness of the universe without it feeling overwhelming, but also it feeling digestible. It's really intriguing to me. I want to know more about some of these other planets, especially involving some things that happen late in the book. Another thing that I really appreciated about Empire of Silence is the fact that Ruocchio knows a lot about some of this ancient philosophy and these philosophers and playwrights. He mentions Shakespeare several times in the first section of the book, or in the first act of the book, I should say. in ways that are really fun to catch, like really fun to be like, hey, I know that, do the whole Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen thing, just like, hey, I know what that is when you catch one of the references, but then the references that you don't catch don't really matter. They're just names in the book in the grand scheme of things. When it comes to quotes and references and stuff like that, Ruocchio is explicit enough with them to make sure that you know what they are, and then if you're interested, you can look them up. So there's interesting little tidbits like that that I really appreciated, but they're not necessarily necessary to understand the whole book. One of the things that I appreciated the most and that I think is going to be the make or break for this book and presumably the entire series as a whole is that Empire of Silence and Sun Eater contains a very human and a very realistic protagonist and narrator in Hadrian Marlowe. And I would say that this holds true as well for most of the side characters. The interactions between people feel so natural, it kind of hurts a lot of the time. Hadrian is pretty much as opposite of a Mary Sue as you can get with a major protagonist character. A lot of the times you don't know what he's uh, planning in terms of just the way that his thought process is going. The framing device of this book makes it so that Hadrian comes across as a very flawed person from the get-go, and that kind of helps in really humanizing him. And even though he is technically a noble for all intents and purposes by blood, as explained and mentioned a lot throughout the book, you can tell that he has issues with that. He doesn't take advantage of it. He doesn't think of himself as above pretty much anybody, and I really appreciate that about him. Just as I mentioned with some of the side characters also feeling human and the interactions, there's a lot of visceral material in terms of even just basic conversations between major characters. Even with the non-human species, there's a lot of it just feels real. A lot of these characters just feel super real. In particular, one thing that I really, really liked about Empire of Silence was the arguments, in particular, like when characters have clashes with each other. Not just physical clashes, but just arguments. Ruocchio told me at one point when I mentioned a very specific argument that just really got to me is that he writes or intends to write his arguments so that both people are right, make it feel like there isn't a right person or a wrong person in the situation so that, it creates this kind of conflict in the reader. I would say he very much succeeded in this because he did this multiple times to me where I couldn't blame reactions that certain people had to Hadrian or even reactions that Hadrian had to some other people, even if I hated the way that they made me feel. It was like, I didn't want this conversation to go this direction, but it felt so real, and I can't blame the other person because they kind of right in their own way. Like I said, yeah, the arguments in particular are very, very good. So if you enjoy realistic character interactions, I think this book has plenty of those. Furthermore, there are great fight scenes. Now, this was something that I kind of hinted at in the first chapter of the book. The first chapter of the book is actually a fight scene in some essence. Perfect introduction to not just the character in the world, but just the book in general. It was very exciting. Ruocchio has several fight scenes throughout the book, some of which are quite short. All of them are fantastic. I really liked the fight scenes in the book. And then another scene, which I will kind of talk about a little bit more explicitly, there's a fantastic dinner scene that is pretty similar to the famous dinner scene from Dune that I just loved. I arguably thought that this deliberation scene in this book was done better than that in Dune. So if you really enjoyed that scene in Dune and you enjoy Hadrian's character particularly, there's a scene I can't remember exactly where, it might be somewhere around the halfway point of the book. That scene in Empire of Silence is really going to do it for you. So I love that scene. It's one of my favorite scenes and chapters that I've read all year, period. I just absolutely loved that. And then I guess since I've been kind of talking a lot about the best elements of Sun Eater, let me discuss one of the major things that I loved, but also kind of hated in a kind of way, is that the climax of this book really, really stressed me out. And as I put it in my Goodreads review, kind of word for word, I'll just read a quote. The climax of this book quote, twisted me into a constrictor knot that still makes my stomach feel weird, end quote. And it kind of left my heart injured in a lot of ways. I have mentioned that the interactions between characters in this book are incredible, and this climax has a lot to do with that. The several chapters leading up to the climax and the climax itself, it is painful. I hated reading it, but had to read it. It was just, oh man, I know that Ruocchio hurts his readers a lot throughout this series. People who have read through the rest of the books, and even people who have read the fifth book, which isn't actually out yet but has an arc available for some people who have applied for it. Well, let's just say that Ruocchio doesn't pull his punches, and he tends to choose violence against the reader. He claims that he doesn't do this on purpose necessarily. He doesn't perceive the readers or the audience as like a specific entity that he's writing for. He's writing firstly for himself. So I'm predicting that I'm going to have a lot more moments like this throughout the rest of the series, but the climax to this book especially did that. There was lots of pain, lots more to come, I'm sure. And despite the climax being really painful for me to read, the resolution of the book is perfect. Like, it's not really spoilery to say this book in a way kind of actually has a happy ending, which was really unexpected. I'm going to cherish the ending to this book for as long as I possibly can, because I know that that is not how it's going to be for pretty much the rest of the series. So yeah, I just really enjoyed this book, but not all books are perfect. In fact, most of them are not. What are the worst elements of Empire of Silence? Now, there's a couple things. The first one, for me, the only thing that I personally really feel is worth complaining about is that the pacing in a couple particular sections is a little bit strange. Now, I'm going to be as vague as possible here, no spoilers, but they're probably around the 50 to 75 pages after Hadrian leaves Delos is paced a little bit weird. I thought there was some strange jumping around in time. Not like huge time jumps or anything, but like there was some strange time jumps and way that Hadrian talks about his time after leaving Delos that I just thought was paced a little bit weird, that was a little bit too slow. And there were a couple interactions during these sections as well that just kind of felt a little bit off as well. So there's not like a major character in this section of the series, but a fairly major character in this section as well that some readers just have no reaction to, that some other readers love. I really liked the character, but for some reason there's some disconnect there as well that some people might have. There are also a couple other instances of this kind of similarly strange, like pacing in terms of the book, not just in terms of time, but in terms of how long the book takes to cover a certain period of time. But none of them feel as weird as the previous one mentioned, and even that isn't that bad. It's just, a couple dozen pages of like this kind of feels a little bit strange. But then once you get into the next major section of the book, it's all okay again. It's just kind of the fact that this being the only issue that I can really come up with as being a problem for my experience personally is the only like objective, I guess, objective problem. It just speaks to the quality of Empire of Silence in total. Like, especially for a debut author, because keep in mind, this was Ruocchio's not just first traditional published book, but his first published book. So I can kind of forgive these somewhat weird sections, act as if they kind of just didn't happen, because the fact that the rest of the book is so good for a debut author is just incredible. It's very easy to forgive this for me. But on the other hand, this next point that I'm going to make in terms of the worst elements of Empire of Silence, this was not a problem that I had, but I think a couple other, just a handful of people that I've come across, might have a problem with this, is that the frame device for the narrative, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the review, may not entirely work for some. This is because Hadrian is recounting this tale kind of like an autobiography. It says Hadrian pretty much nearing the end of his life, discussing the events that lead up to what will ultimately be the end of the series. So it's made very clear, I'm pretty sure, in the first chapter, that we kind of know how the series ends, just in terms of what the ultimate finale is going to encompass in a couple different instances. It's not like spoilery in terms of actually telling us what happened. It doesn't do that, but in a sense we know how the story ends. So some readers will be like, well, if we technically already know how Sun Eater is going to end at the, conclusion of the 7-book series, why read it? Well, it's not quite so simple as that to me. I don't see this framing device as a problem, just kind of a unique way of telling Hadrian's story. I mean, if you really want to, nitpick at this kind of a thing, technically Dune spoils itself as well with the epigraphs at the beginning of each chapter. So what's wrong with it just being slightly more explicit here? It's just kind of a different way to tell the tale. The only problem with this framing device for the narrative that I see personally is how it kind of handles things like foreshadowing and, I guess, plot twists, I'll say. As I mentioned in my Goodreads review, the importance of these elements are much lower than in most other works, especially, series as long, large, epic in scope as this one. But I do have justification for this, at least in my mind, that works for me. It's just that these books, like I said, are acting as Hadrian's autobiography. They're following what is supposed to be his real life, so to speak. And think about it. Is there foreshadowing in your life? Not really. There tends to not be foreshadowing in your real life. Are you able to predict twists that are coming to you in your life? Well, no, you're pretty much not. And I see this as pretty much exactly what's going on here. The idea is that Ruocchio is always catching the reader off guard, but he's not going so, Looney Tunes insane with the twist that he decides to do that it's unbelievable. Everything that happens, all of the twists, all of the things that are kind of built up to in a quote unquote foreshadowing type of way that ultimately don't come to anything in this book, which I'm sure several of them might come to something in later books. Who knows? The point is that he's able to build up to these things and do twists that feel believable, that never catch the reader totally off guard, but also make them feel like they're realistic. That's basically the whole gist of it. And another way that I think about it as well is the fact that most first person narrations aren't really told in an autobiographical sense, technically speaking. Like, the one that comes to my mind is Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Percy Jackson, as the first person narrator of that series, is not writing down the tale of that series as if he's like recounting it later in his life. That's not the framing device for the narrative. It's just him telling his story in a book format as if he's like describing everything that's happening in the moment in his head, as if the books are a mental journal or something like that. And I feel like that is the way that most first person narratives are framed. They're not meant to be, I feel like most of them, at least the ones that I've read, are not meant to be instances of a book literally being an autobiographical telling. Empire of Silence is meant to be that. But now we come to the conclusion of this review as normal. I will just read a quick quote, I believe somewhere in the middle of my Goodreads review, and that is quite simply that Empire of Silence is equal parts predictable and unpredictable in the most satisfying of ways, never going where the reader anticipates or wants, but never disappointing the reader in the process. I really enjoyed this book because of just the way it handled these things. I really liked Hadrian as a narrator. I really liked all the twists that came. I really liked the way that the book, being as long as it is, was able to you know, do so many things without feeling like it was, loaded, was able to cover so much in a way that it did. This book took me a little bit to read because in the middle of it, I kind of had a week or two, like a week and a half reading slump in the middle because of different things that were going on in real life. But I'm really glad that I read this in full. I'm really happy that I finished it because holy cow, that climax was amazing, even if it hurt me. I anxiously await giving my heart to Ruocchio and Hadrian just for them to rip it to pieces in future entries of the book. So, check out seasonalproductions.com as always for all of my YouTube and writing content in one place. I'll be back again next week actually with a review for Howling Dark, and at the time that I'm actually recording this Empire of Silence review, I actually haven't read Howling Dark yet, but next week will be my review for that book, so stick around next week.